Unit 12, Gateway. The role of science can sometimes be overstated, with its advocates slipping into scientism. Scientism is the view that the scientific description of reality is the only truth there is. With the advance of science, there has been a tendency to slip into scientism and assume that any factual claim can be authenticated if and only if the term scientific can correctly be ascribed to it. The consequence is that non-scientific approaches to reality, and that can include all the arts, religion, and personal, emotional, and value-laden ways of encountering the world, may become labeled as merely subjective, and therefore of little account in terms of describing the way the world is. The philosophy of science seeks to avoid crude scientism and get a balanced view on what the scientific method can and cannot achieve. Exercise 1. You may have noticed that people differ in the schemes they tend to use when evaluating others. College professors are often concerned with whether someone is smart, sales managers with whether someone is persuasive, and those involved in the entertainment business with whether someone has charisma. As these examples illustrate, the role of the evaluator or the context in which a target person is encountered often influences which traits or schemas are used. But sometimes the schema is simply determined by habit. If a person uses a particular schema frequently, it may become chronically accessible and therefore likely to be used still more frequently in the future. A frequently activated schema functions much like a recently activated one. Its heightened accessibility increases the likelihood that it will be applied to understanding a new stimulus. Exercise 2. Not everyone comes to see the game. For some, the contest merely provides the setting and opportunities for the expression of other motives. The social contact provided by the crowd itself suggests a reason for people to attend. This very point was elaborated by William McDougall in a book published in 1908, in which he developed his case for the existence of a gregarious instinct in humans. The question he posed at the turn of the century certainly argues convincingly for the view that we are social creatures. However, additionally labeling the observed behavior as an instinct creates a tautology that adds nothing to our understanding. McDougall asks his readers, what proportion of the 10,000 witnesses of a football match would stand for an hour or more in the wind and rain if each man were isolated from the rest of the crowd and saw only the players? We would guess very few in 1908, fewer today. Exercise 3. There is a widespread belief that creativity is best served through inner peace, stillness, and calmness. One of my colleagues was convinced that her own creative writing was best when she had no distractions, quietly sipping tea in a peaceful setting. However, after 3 months of such languid writing days, she produced nothing that she was proud of. Shortly thereafter, her first baby was born, and her schedule went from long, open, peaceful, unstructured days to tightly orchestrated, minute-by-minute slots, punctuated by extreme activity. The result? She became prolifically productive. In her words, she was wired. The way she put it to me was, I have 90 minutes when Sam is napping, and I run to the computer and write like crazy. I'm totally focused. Turns out, my colleague is onto something. In fact, it is better to be aroused when attempting to think creatively. Exercise 4. During a particularly trying time early in my sales career, a sales manager gave me a poster that read, "If it is to be, it is up to me." I realized within that moment that if any changes or improvements were going to occur in my outside world, they needed to begin within my inside world. In life, all meaningful or macrocosmic change within society begins on a microcosmic level. That's you and me. You cannot authoritatively impose effective change upon any society. Rather, it must be a choice that is felt deep within the consciousness of its inhabitants. Collectively, society's individuals must band together and say with one voice, "We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore." For this to occur, however, one person must be willing to take the reins of change, with all of the risk those reins entail, and with an iron resolve, lead the charge of effective change. Exercise 5. According to Greek mythology, the oracle at Delphi was consulted to gauge the risk of waging a war. In modern times, the term Delphi refers to a group survey technique for combining the opinions of several people to develop a collective judgment. The technique comprises a series of structured questions and feedback reports. Each respondent is given a series of questions. Example, what are the 5 most significant risks in this project? To which he writes his opinions and reasons. The opinions of everyone surveyed are summarized in a report and returned to the respondents, who then have the opportunity to modify their opinions. Because the written responses are kept anonymous, no one feels pressured to conform to anyone else's opinion. If people change their opinions, they must explain the reason why. If they don't, they must also explain why. The process continues until the group reaches a collective opinion. Studies have proven the technique to be an effective way of reaching consensus. Exercise 6. What is the basic idea of sociology? It is this: social structure pushes people around, influences their careers, and even affects how they think. My Tougaloo College students readily understood that social structure pushed people around. Not one of their parents was an architect, for example, because no school in the Deep South in their parents' generation both taught architecture and admitted African Americans. So my Tougaloo students knew how social structure might influence careers. Then, too, neighbors of theirs, white children, had been their friends when they were 4 and 5 years old. But by the time they were 14 and 15, a barrier had gone up between them. My black undergraduates could see that this racial bias was hardly innate. Rather, it showed that social structure affects how people think. Hence, they were open to the sociological perspective. Exercise 7. According to the scholars of the Indian traditions, Vedas, the origin of religion was to be sought in the impressions that natural phenomena made upon man. The mythological figures were thought to be personifications of natural objects. The impressive manifestations of nature stimulated the personifying fantasy of man. The primary stage of religion was not due to the religious nature of man, or to the need of the human heart, as O. Mueller expressed it in his book, but to man's elementary capability of seeing personal figures in the impersonal phenomenon of his surroundings. What finally led to the formation of religion was thus the elaboration of a nature mythology and the veneration of the respective figures. The beginning of religion was the worship of many natural objects, with the predominance of such phenomena as the sun, the sky, thunderstorms, lightning, rain, and fire. Exercise 8. A well-functioning democracy requires a media system that provides diverse sources of information and encourages civic participation. The government once considered the airwaves such an integral part of our democracy that politicians decided the public should own and control them. It is time for the public to reclaim the responsibility of producing quality media from the corporate conglomerates. The first step is to break up the concentration of media power. Let's give control to a greater number of smaller companies that could legitimately compete with a broader range of information. Also, we must create and maintain a non-commercial public media system, as well as independent alternative media that exists outside the control of transnational corporations and advertisers. The rise of independent political blogs and that of alternative podcasts, radio networks, and television channels are all examples of citizens rising up to take back control of our media. Exercise 9. Consider the question often asked by scientists, including even those who are well disposed toward animals, as to whether the hen suffers from what she has never known. The Oxford researcher Marion Dawkins conducted experiments to determine what hens felt about their homes. Somewhat to her surprise, she found that hens who had been confined to battery cages no larger than a sheet of newspaper, when given the choice between a small outside run with grass and the cages they had known all their lives chose to stay in the cages. And fowl expert Valerie Porter points out that chickens taken from a battery cage will be in a considerable state of what you might call cultural shock if they are deprived of the only type of environment they have ever known. In fact, they will curl up in a corner in a state of terrified agoraphobia, and it will take a great deal of time and patient understanding to rehabilitate them to real life. Exercise 10. The cyclical nature of success and failure has been well established in the field of modern bridge design and engineering, in which experience spans about 2 centuries. Unfortunately, the lessons learned from failures are too often forgotten in the course of the renewed period of success that takes place in the context of technological advance. This masks the underlying fact that the design process now is fundamentally the same as the design process 30, 300, even 3,000 years ago. The creative and inherently human process of design, upon which all technological development depends, is in effect timeless. What this means, in part, is that the same cognitive mistakes that were made 3,000, 300, or 30 years ago can be made again today, and can be expected to be made indefinitely into the future. Failures are part of the technological condition. Exercise 11. The popular press deems reshoring to be bringing manufacturing back home from a current location that is not home. The term is agnostic as to whether the manufacturing being brought home occurred in a wholly owned facility in an offshore location or in the factory of an offshore supplier. GE, for example, reshored its appliance manufacturing from its production facility in China to the U.S. in its own plant to meet the U.S. demand, whereas the U.S.-based Vanneman Manufacturing decided to no longer buy sheet metal fabrication from an overseas supplier and to instead source from a local supplier to meet demand in the U.S. Both would be considered reshoring, more precisely, reshoring back to the U.S. Reshoring is fundamentally concerned with where manufacturing activities are to be performed, independent of who is performing the manufacturing activities in question, a location decision only, as opposed to a decision regarding location and ownership. Exercise 12. Mark Leary and his colleagues led participants to believe that they were to perform a group task. Before the task, each participant was asked to write an essay about what it means to be me and the kind of person I would most like to be. The experimenter then gave each person's essay to other participants in another location, who were asked to indicate who they would like to work with in the group setting. The experimenter ignored the participants' actual preferences and randomly assigned some participants to a condition in which they had supposedly been passed over by the others and had to work alone, and other participants to a condition in which they were in high demand by others and worked with a group. Participants in the work-alone condition, who believed they had been excluded, reported lower levels of self-esteem than those involved by the group. Our momentary feelings of self-worth strongly depend on the extent to which others approve of us and include us. Unit 12. Gateway.